A judge's robe is supposed to be a symbol of impartial justice. But what happens when the man wearing it is a tyrant cloaking his hatred in the language of the law? In the city of Oakhaven, Judge Marcus Thorne was the law. His word was final, his bias was absolute, and his contempt for people of color was an open secret. One Tuesday morning, he set his sights on a new target, an unassuming black woman in his courtroom for a minor traffic violation. He laughed at her, insulted her, and prepared to ruin her day. He had no idea he wasn't just judging a citizen. He was about to be judged by the Attorney General. The summons arrived on a Wednesday, a sliver of beige cardstock tucked between a Pottery Barn catalog and a letter from a local charity. To Imani Hayes, it felt like a paper cut, a minor, unexpected irritant in an otherwise meticulously ordered life. The violation cited was an improper lane change, an event she had no memory of. The location was a stretch of road she rarely traveled, and the time-stamped 2:17 p.m. on a Friday corresponded with a weekly budget meeting she had never missed in her 4 years on the job. Imani ran a manicured finger over the embossed seal of the Oakhaven County District Court. Oakhaven. The name alone left a sour taste in her mouth. It was a sprawling, prosperous city on the surface with gleaming glass towers and manicured suburban lawns. But Imani knew its underbelly. She knew about the whispers that slithered out of its police precincts, the stories of biased traffic stops that disproportionately targeted black and brown drivers, and the hushed complaints about its judiciary. At the heart of that system was the courthouse, a brutalist concrete fortress that seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome. And at the heart of the courthouse was Judge Marcus Thorne. His reputation preceded him. In legal circles, he was known as the Hammer. He was a man who saw the law not as a scale to be balanced, but as a weapon to be wielded. His rulings were legendarily harsh, his courtroom demeanor notoriously abrasive, and his prejudice, though never officially censured, was the subject of countless backroom conversations and desperate appeals. Imani placed the summons on her marble kitchen island. Her first instinct was to delegate. She could have one of her aides, a dozen sharp, capable young lawyers who worked under her, make a call, clear up what was obviously a clerical error, and make the whole thing disappear. That would be the efficient thing to do, the logical thing. But something held her back. For years, her office had been compiling data on judicial overreach and systemic bias. Oakhaven County and Judge Thorne's courtroom specifically was a bright red flag on their charts. The statistics were damning. Defendants of color in Thorne's court received sentences that were on average 30% longer than those given to white defendants for identical offenses. The number of complaints filed against him that were quietly dismissed by the state's Judicial Review Board was staggeringly high. People like her grandmother, who had lived in Oakhaven her whole life, called it the place where justice goes to die. This summons wasn't just a random error. It felt like a symptom of the very disease she was fighting. To dismiss it would be to turn a blind eye, to use her privilege, to sidestep a problem that thousands of others could not. It felt wrong. It felt like a betrayal of the oath she had taken. "You're going, aren't you?" The voice belonged to her husband, Robert, a history professor with a calm, steady presence that had always been her anchor. He walked into the kitchen already dressed in his tweed jacket and poured himself a cup of coffee. He'd seen the look on her face. "It's a mistake, Rob," she said, her voice quiet. "I was in the middle of a fiscal review with the entire department staff." "I know," he said, leaning against the counter, "and you could have it erased with a single phone call. But you're not going to, are you? You want to see it for yourself?" He knew her too well. She wasn't just Imani. Hayes, the woman who loved jazz music and spent her Saturdays gardening. She was Attorney General Imani Hayes. And the Attorney General did not ignore a summons, especially not one that led directly into the belly of the beast. She wanted to walk into that courthouse, not as a figure of authority, but as one of the people. She wanted to feel the chill of the marble floors, see the faces of the court officers, and stand before the infamous Judge Thorne as a regular citizen. She wanted to see the system from the inside out. "I need to," she finally admitted. "How can I claim to be fixing a system I haven't even seen from the other side of the bench?" Robert nodded slowly, a flicker of concern in his eyes. "Just be careful, Imani. That place, it eats people up. Don't let it get to you." "I have no intention of letting it," she said, her resolve hardening. She made a decision. She would not use her title. She would not pull any strings. She would dress down, take the day off, and walk into the Oakhaven County District Court as Manny Hayes' citizen, accused of an improper lane change. It was a risk. In that courtroom, her title, her degrees, her years of service would mean nothing. She would be just another black woman standing before a white judge who held all the power. And that was exactly the point. The paper cut was small, but it could expose a much deeper wound. The Oak Haven courthouse was even more imposing in person than it was in architectural photos. Cold, gray, and utterly devoid of warmth. Its massive concrete columns felt less like pillars of justice and more like the bars of a cage. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of cheap, disinfectant anxiety and desperation. It was a place where hope came to be processed, filed, and more often than not denied. Imani dressed in a simple pair of dark slacks and a modest knit sweater. Her hair pulled back in a simple bun, blended seamlessly into the crowd of people huddled on the hard wooden benches. She clutched a plain leather handbag, the summons tucked neatly inside. No briefcase, no power suit, no hint of the authority she wielded. Today she was anonymous, and the anonymity was a chillingly effective disguise. The whispers started almost immediately. They were the background noise of the hallway, a low hum of fear and frustration. Got Thorne today. My lawyer told me to just plead guilty no matter what. Said it's better than making him angry. My cousin got 60 days for a broken taillight. 60 days because he tried to argue. Just keep your head down. Don't look him in the eye. He hates that. The name Thorne was repeated like a grim mantra, a curse spoken in hushed tones. Imani listened, her stomach tightening with each story. These weren't just anecdotes. They were survival guides for navigating a broken system. They were the oral history of a community held hostage by one man's prejudice. She watched as a young Latino man, no older than 20, was led away in handcuffs, his shoulders slumped in defeat. His public defender, a Harry Dale-looking woman with a stack of files teetering in her arms, gave him a brief apologetic pat on the shoulder before rushing off to her next lost cause. Imani's gaze drifted to the court officers. They moved with a swaggering, heavy-footed confidence. They barked orders, their voices sharp and devoid of empathy. When a frail, elderly woman asked a simple question about which courtroom she needed to be, and a burly officer named Miller, whose name tag was clearly visible, rolled his eyes. "Can't you read the board, lady?" he grunted, gesturing vaguely down the hall. "Now get out of the way. You're holding up the line." Imani felt a hot flash of anger. She saw the woman flinch, her shoulders curling inward as she shuffled away, humiliated. It was a small cruelty, a casual assertion of power, but it spoke volumes about the culture of this place. This was Thor's kingdom, and everyone from the Baifs to the Clarks seemed to have adopted his brand of callous indifference. Her case was scheduled for courtroom 4B. As she approached, she saw a young black woman, probably in her late 20s, leaning against the wall, tears silently streaming down her face. A man who appeared to be her husband was trying to comfort her. His own expression, a mask of helpless rage. "It's okay, baby. It's okay," he murmured, his voice cracking. "We'll figure it out. We'll appeal." "Appeal?" The woman sobbed, her voice muffled against his chest. "With what money, James? He took my license for a year. A whole year for 3 unpaid parking tickets. How am I supposed to get to work? How are we supposed to feed our kids?" Imani's heart ached for them. She had seen the file on this kind of predatory fining system. It was designed to trap people in a cycle of debt and punishment, a system that disproportionately affected the poor and communities of color, and Judge Thorne was its most enthusiastic enforcer. When the doors to 4B finally opened, a stern-faced clerk with a severe haircut called out names from a list. All parties for the 10 a.m. traffic docket form a single line. No talking. Phones off. Have your summons ready. Emmy fell into line, the whispers from the hallway still echoing in her ears. She was no longer just an observer. She was a participant, another body in the machine. As she stepped through the heavy oak doors, the air grew colder. The room was cavernous and dark with wood-paneled walls that seemed to absorb all light and sound. At the front, raised high above everyone else on an imposing dais, sat the bench. It was empty for now, but its presence dominated the room. This was a stage built for a single actor, a throne room for a king. And everyone in the room, the nervous defendants, the exhausted public defenders, the stoic prosecutors, was waiting for King Marcus Thorne to make his entrance. Imani took a seat on one of the benches, her back straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She felt a profound sense of dread, but it was mingled with a cold, clear-eyed resolve. She had come here to see the truth, and she had a feeling the show was about to begin. The side door to the courtroom swung open with a sharp crack, and Judge Marcus Thorne swept in, his black robe billowing behind him like a storm cloud. He was a man in his late 60s with a shock of silver hair, a florid face, and eyes the color of faded denim. He settled into his high-backed leather chair with the weary sigh of a man burdened by the great and terrible weight of his own importance. "All rise," the bailiff groaned. The room shuffled to its feet. Thorne scanned the crowd below him, his gaze lingering for a moment on the faces of color, a faint, almost imperceptible sneer playing on his lips. He banged his gavel once, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. "Be seated." He began to work through the docket with a brutal, merciless efficiency. He was a master of the small humiliation, the casual degradation. He called a young man Einstein for misunderstanding, a legal term. He told a woman pleading for leniency on a speeding ticket that if you can't afford the fine, you shouldn't have been driving a car that nice. Each comment was a small jab, a way of reminding everyone in the room of his absolute power. Finally, he called her name. Imani Hayes. Improper lane change. Imani stood and walked to the defendant's table, her steps measured and confident. She stood straight, her hands clasped behind her back, and looked directly at the judge. Thorne peered down at her over his reading glasses, his eyes narrowing. "Well now, Imani Hayes, what do we have here?" He shuffled the papers in front of him with theatrical slowness. "See here, you cut off another vehicle on the Oak Street overpass, a very dangerous maneuver. What do you have to say for yourself, Miss Hayes, Your Honor?" Emmy began, her voice calm, "And even I believe there has been a mistake. I was not on the Oak Street overpass on the date and time in question. I was at my place of work in a scheduled meeting with over 30 colleagues." Thorne leaned back, a smirk spreading across his face. He chuckled a low, rumbling sound that made a man's skin crawl. "A mistake. Oh, aye.
See? A classic case of it wasn't me. I get that a lot in here. Usually followed by a story about a long-lost twin or a borrowed car. So where is this place of work that provides you with such a convenient alibi?" "I work for the State Department of Justice," Imani stated simply, choosing her words with care. The smirk on Thorne's face widened into a full-blown grin. He laughed louder this time and shared a look with the bailiff officer, Miller, who snickered in response. The sound of their shared amusement echoed in the tense courtroom. "The Department of Justice!" Thorne beamed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Is that so? And what do you do there? A janitor? A cafeteria lady, perhaps? Let me guess. You're the head of the mailroom." The prosecutor, a young, ambitious man named Peterson, shifted uncomfortably on his feet, but said nothing. He knew the judge's temperament. Intervening would be professional suicide. Imani's composure did not waver. "My specific role is not relevant to this matter, Your Honor. The fact is, I have proof of my whereabouts." "Proof," Thorne scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Everyone has proof. A note from your mother, a signed affidavit from your cousin. I've heard it all." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried through the entire room. "Listen to me. I've been on this bench for 30 years. I know how this works. I look at you and I know what I see. People like you. You think the rules don't apply. You have a chip on your shoulder, a sense of entitlement." His eyes were cold, his words dripping with venomous prejudice. He wasn't talking about a traffic ticket anymore. He was talking about a race. "Now here's what's going to happen." Thorne continued, his voice hardening into a menacing growl. "You can stand here and spin your little tales about your job at the Justice Department, and I will find you in contempt. I will max out the fine, suspend your license for a year, and I might even throw in a weekend in county lockup to teach you some respect for this court. Or you can plead guilty pay, a simple $200 fine, and we can all get on with our day." He smiled, a predator's smile. "The choice is yours. What's it going to be?" The courtroom was dead silent. Every eye was on Imani. They saw a lone black woman cornered and insulted by a powerful white judge. They saw a familiar story playing out another life about to be casually derailed by ingrained bigotry. They expected her to fold, to cry, to accept the unjust plea deal, just to make it all stop. Emmy took a slow, deliberate breath. She did not look away from Judge Thorne's smug face. The time for quiet observation was over. "Actually, Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing out with a newfound clarity and strength that seemed to startle him. "There is a third option.
Judge Thorne's condescending smile faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. A third option? There's no third option. I just laid out your choices. Are you having trouble understanding me? No, Your Honor, I understand you perfectly, Imani replied, her voice as sharp and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. The quiet deference was gone, replaced by an unmistakable tone of command. Perhaps the issue is that you do not understand who I am. A ripple of confusion went through the courtroom. Who did this woman think she was? Prosecutor Peterson took a half step forward, a warning on his lips, but something in Imani's posture made him hesitate. This was not the demeanor of a woman about to be crushed. This was the demeanor of a woman holding a royal flush. Imani reached into her simple leather handbag. For a moment, the Bath Miller tensed his hand, instinctively moving toward his sidearm, but Imani moved with a calm, deliberate grace. She withdrew not a weapon, but a wallet. It was a simple, elegant black leather case. She flipped it open, revealing not a driver's license, but a gold badge gleaming under the courtroom's dim fluorescent lights. "My name," she announced, her voice resonating with an authority that silenced every breath in the room, "is Imani Hayes, and my specific role at the State Department of Justice, the one you so casually dismissed." She paused, letting the weight of the moment hang in the air. She locked eyes with Judge Thorne, whose face was rapidly draining of color, the floor giving way to a pasty, sickly white. "I am the Attorney General for this state." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a dense, heavy vacuum, in which the only sound was the frantic thumping of Judge Thorne's own heart in his ears. The words hung in the air, seeming to rearrange the very fabric of reality within the courtroom. The anonymous black woman at the defendant's table was gone. In her place stood the chief law enforcement officer of the entire state. The transformation was staggering. The prosecutor Peterson looked as though he'd been struck by lightning, his mouth hanging slightly agape. The court reporter's fingers froze over her keys. Officer Miller, the bailiff, took an involuntary step back, his earlier bravado vanishing like smoke. He suddenly seemed to be looking at a ghost, but all eyes were on Judge Thorne. The sneer had melted from his face, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. His mind reeled frantically, replaying the last 10 minutes. People like you, chip on your shoulder, a janitor. Each insult, each casual barb, each drop of racist condescension now felt like a nail he had hammered into his own coffin. He had not just insulted a defendant. He had mocked, belittled, and threatened the one person in the state who had the power to destroy his career, his reputation, and his freedom. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, croaking sound emerged. He looked from the gold badge in her hand to the cold, unwavering fury in her eyes. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted. It had been utterly and violently inverted. The man on the throne was suddenly the one in the stocks. Imani calmly closed her wallet and placed it back in her bag. She then turned her head slightly to address the stunned prosecutor. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "you are a representative of the state. You stood by and allowed a sitting judge to engage in what I can only describe as a grotesque abuse of power and blatant racial harassment. Your silence has been noted." Peterson flinched as if he'd been slapped. Then she turned her attention back to the judge. "And as for you, Judge Thorne," she said, her voice now ringing with the full weight of her office, "this travesty of a hearing is concluded, but I assure you my business in this courtroom and with you is just beginning." She took a step back from the table. "Effective immediately, I am opening a full investigation by the Attorney General's office into the patterns and practices of the Oak Haven County District Court, with a specific and targeted inquiry into every single case you have presided over for the last 10 years. She then turned to face the stunned gallery, to the young couple she had seen crying in the hallway, to the elderly woman who had been humiliated by the bailiff, to every person who had ever walked into this room and been stripped of their dignity. She made a silent promise. The reign of the hammer was over. The fallout was immediate and explosive. Before Imani had even left the courthouse, her cell phone was buzzing with calls from her chief of staff, who had been alerted by a frantic call from the court administrator. The news of what had happened in courtroom 4B was spreading through the legal and political circles of Oak Haven like a wildfire. Back in her own office, a calm, light-filled space that stood in stark contrast to the oppressive gloom of Thorne's courtroom, Imani assembled a team. This was not going to be a quiet behind-the-scenes review. This was going to be a full-scale, public, and aggressive investigation. I don't want a review. I want an excavation, she told her top deputies. I want to dig down to the foundations of that courthouse and expose every rotten piece of timber we find. This isn't just about Thorne. It's about the system that protected him, the culture that enabled him, and every person who looked the other way. She appointed David Chen, the head of her civil rights division, to lead the task force. Chen was a brilliant, relentless investigator with a bulldog's tenacity and a mind like a steel trap. He had a reputation for being immune to political pressure and for pursuing justice with a singular, unwavering focus. David, Imani said, looking him directly in the eye, I want everything. Financial records, sentencing data case files, personnel complaints, appeal records, subpoena anyone and everyone. I want to know who Thorne had lunch with, who he played golf with, and who funded his last retention campaign. I want to know about every public defender who felt pressured to push a bad plea deal, and every prosecutor who was rewarded for feeding Thorne's conviction machine. Consider it done, General, Chen replied, his expression grim. He had been trying to get a foothold to investigate Oak Haven for years, but had always been blocked by jurisdictional squabbles and political roadblocks. Now the Attorney General herself had just kicked the door wide open. Within 24 hours, the Oak Haven courthouse was swarming with investigators from the AG's office. They arrived not with guns, but with subpoenas and document requests, which were in many ways far more terrifying to the entrenched bureaucracy. They quietly and professionally began securing hard drives, boxing up case files, and scheduling interviews with every clerk, bailiff, and administrator in the building. The atmosphere in the courthouse had transformed overnight. The casual swagger of the court officers was gone, replaced by a nervous, tight-lipped anxiety. Officer Miller, the bailiff, who had snickered alongside Thorne, was one of the first to be interviewed. He sat sweating under the cool, methodical questioning of one of Chen's junior investigators, his bravado crumbling into a pathetic attempt to downplay his role. I was just, following the judge's lead. He sets the tone. Judge Thorne was immediately suspended from the bench by the state's chief judicial administrator, pending the outcome of the investigation. He barricaded himself in his sprawling suburban home, refusing all calls from the press. The man who had been the undisputed king of his domain was now a prisoner in his own house. The walls he had built to protect his power now serving to isolate him completely. The investigation began to send shockwaves through the city. The mayor's office released a carefully worded statement expressing deep concern and promising full cooperation. Powerful lawyers and businessmen who had been Thorne's staunchest allies suddenly couldn't remember the last time they'd spoken to him. But the most significant effect was on the community. For the first time, a hotline set up by the Attorney General's office was flooded with calls. People who had been too afraid to speak up for years were now telling their stories. The young mother, whose license Thorne had suspended for unpaid parking tickets, called the family of the boy, who got 60 days for a broken taillight called. They spoke of lost jobs, broken families, and the crushing weight of a justice system that had treated them as less than human. Each call was a new thread for David Chen and his team. Each story was a piece of a horrifying mosaic. They were no longer just investigating a single racist judge. They were uncovering a conspiracy of silence, a deeply embedded system of oppression that had been allowed to fester for decades. Imani's personal humiliation in that courtroom had become the catalyst for a reckoning that was long overdue. The excavation had begun, and the ground was already starting to shake. The sheer volume of data was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of case files, a decade's worth of sentencing records, and terabytes of digital communications. David Chen's team worked around the clock, fueled by coffee and a growing sense of outrage. They used sophisticated data analysis software to crunch the numbers, and what they found was even worse than the anecdotal evidence had suggested. The racial disparity in Thorne's sentencing was not just a trend, it was a rigidly enforced mathematical formula. For nonviolent drug offenses, black defendants received sentences that were on average 8 years longer than white defendants with identical criminal histories and charges. Fines and court fees levied on minority defendants were consistently 5,000 and 75% higher. The numbers painted a portrait of a two-tiered system of justice, punitive and unforgiving for one group and lenient for another. But Chen knew that statistics alone weren't enough. He needed human stories to give the numbers a soul. He needed to show the real-world impact of Thorne's bigotry. His investigators fanned out across Oak Haven, visiting community centers, churches, and barber hops, places where people felt safe enough to talk. They found Sarah Jenkins, a former court clerk who had worked under Thorne for 15 years before taking early retirement, citing stress. At first, she was terrified to speak. She lived in a small apartment and cared for her elderly mother. She couldn't afford to make enemies. "You don't understand," she whispered to the investigator who visited her home. "Judge Thorne, he sees everything. He has friends everywhere, even now." But the investigator was patient. She explained that the Attorney General's office could offer her protection. She told her about the dozens of other victims who were coming forward. Slowly, tentatively, Sarah began to talk. She spoke of a special list Thorne kept. If a defendant was represented by a certain group of activist lawyers from the Oakhaven Justice Project, Thorne would automatically schedule their hearings for late on a Friday afternoon, deny every procedural motion, and impose the maximum possible penalty just to punish the lawyers for daring to challenge him. She recounted a chilling incident where Thorne had overheard a black defendant muttering under his breath in the hallway. Thorne had the man brought back into the courtroom, charged him with contempt, and sentenced him to an additional 30 days in jail. He said he needed to teach some respect. Sarah recalled her voice trembling. But it wasn't about respect, it was about power. It was about breaking people. The most damning discovery came from Thorne's financial records. Chen's forensic accountants found a pattern of unusual payments into a private investment account belonging to the judge. The payments were traced back to a series of shell corporations owned by the proprietor of a local private prison company, CCA Corrections. Further digging revealed a sickening quid pro quo. The more people Thorne sent to jail, and the longer their sentences, the more money flowed into his account. He wasn't just a bigot. He was profiting from his own brand of assembly line injustice, turning human lives into a revenue stream. The investigation also implicated others. Prosecutor Peterson, it turned out, had an unusually high conviction rate in Thorne's courtroom because he had an unspoken agreement with the judge. He would never challenge Thorne's biased rulings or question his often illegal procedural shortcuts. In exchange, Thorne ensured Peterson's cases sailed through padding his resume and fast-tracking his career. Peterson had built his reputation on the backs of the people Thorne railroaded. The web of corruption was intricate and deep. It implicated bail bondsmen who kicked back money to court clerks for referrals, police officers who knew their questionable arrests would never be scrutinized in Thorne's court, and a judicial review board stacked with Thorne's old friends who had systematically buried every complaint filed against him. Imani Hayes reviewed the daily briefings from Chen with a heavy heart. Each new revelation was a fresh horror. This was a cancer that had metastasized throughout the entire Oakhaven justice system. Her initial goal had been to hold one man accountable. Now she realized she had to perform radical surgery on an entire institution. "This is bigger than Thorne," she said to Chen. During a late-night meeting, "He's the symptom, not the disease. We need to expose the entire network. Every person who was complicit, every person who profited, we're going to dismantle it piece by rotten piece." As David Chen's investigation tightened, its net judge Marcus Thorne's world shrank. His friends stopped returning his calls. His golf club membership was quietly suspended. The allies who had once flocked to his side now treated him like a leper. The power he had wielded with such arrogance had evaporated, leaving behind a desperate, cornered old man. But Thorne was not one to go down without a fight. He hired a high-priced defense attorney, a notorious legal pit bull named Arthur Vance, who immediately went on the offensive. Vance held a press conference on the steps of the courthouse, decrying the Attorney General's investigation as a politically motivated witch hunt and a gross overreach of executive power. He painted Thorne as a victim, a dedicated public servant being targeted by a radical AG with an agenda. Behind the scenes, Thorne was far less composed. He was a man unraveling. He spent his days pacing the lavish study of his home, a glass of expensive whiskey constantly in his hand. He made frantic, paranoid calls to old contacts, trying to pull strings that were no longer attached to anything. He tried to intimidate potential witnesses, leaving veiled threats on their voicemails, actions that were duly recorded by Chen's team and added to the growing mountain of evidence against him. His most desperate move was to try and discredit the investigation star witness, Sarah Jenkins, the former Claire. Thorne knew she had kept meticulous personal notes over the years, a work diary, she called it. He knew those diaries contained a detailed record of his most egregious conduct. He had to neutralize her. Thorne reached out to a disgraced former police detective he had helped avoid prosecution years earlier, a man named Frank Rizzo. He tasked Rizzo with digging up dirt on Sarah, anything that could be used to destroy her credibility. Rizzo, indebted and immoral, went to work. He began harassing Sarah, following her, and interviewing her estranged ex-husband, trying to manufacture a narrative that she was a vindictive, unstable liar. But the Attorney General's office was one step ahead. They had anticipated this move. The moment Sarah agreed to cooperate, she was placed under state protection. Rizzo's clumsy attempts at intimidation were all caught on surveillance. His meetings with Thorne were photographed. Instead of discrediting Sarah, Thorne had only succeeded in adding witness tampering and conspiracy to his list of potential charges. The final nail in his coffin was provided by Prosecutor Peterson. Faced with the evidence of his complicity and the promise of a lengthy prison sentence, Peterson cracked. He gave Chin's team a detailed hour-by-hour account of how Thorne ran his courtroom, confirming Sarah Jenkins' testimony and providing an insider's view of the corrupt bargains and backroom deals. In exchange for a plea deal and full immunity, he agreed to testify against his former mentor. He handed over emails and text messages that unequivocally proved Thorne's racial animus and his corrupt relationship with CCA corrections. The evidence was now an avalanche. There was the undeniable statistical data, the damning financial trail, the courageous testimony of dozens of victims, the meticulous diaries of a trusted clerk, and now the full confession of his own protege. The walls had not just closed in on Marcus Thorne, they had been completely sealed. Arthur Vance Thorne's pitbull attorney saw the writing on the wall. The evidence was irrefutable. A trial would be a slaughter. He advised Thorne to consider a plea bargain. The news broke the old judge. The idea of admitting guilt of surrendering was anathema to him. In his mind, he had done nothing wrong. He had simply been maintaining order, upholding a certain standard. The fury and denial curdled into a bitter, self-pitying despair. The man who had sat in judgment over
thousands of others was now facing his own day of reckoning. Stripped of his power, abandoned by his allies, and trapped by the consequences of his own hatred. The hearing was not held in the grand, intimidating courtroom where Thorne had once reigned. Instead, it took place in a sterile modern chamber before the State Commission on Judicial Conduct. The room was packed with journalists, legal scholars, and many of the faces Imani had seen in the hallway of the Oak Haven courthouse that fateful morning. The young couple was there holding hands. The elderly woman who had been insulted by the bailiff sat in the front row, her expression one of quiet vindication. Marcus Thorne entered the room, a changed man. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a stooped, shuffling gait. His expensive suit hung loosely on his shrunken frame. His face was pale and drawn, the fit complexion of a man used to good food and fine wine, replaced by the ashen gray of fear. He did not look at the gallery. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor in front of him. Imani Hayes was also present. She did not sit with the prosecution team. She sat in the public gallery, just another citizen watching the proceedings. She wore a simple professional dress. She was not here as a victim seeking revenge, but as the Attorney General, witnessing the final necessary act of a process she had set in motion. Her presence was a silent, powerful testament to the principle that no one, not even a judge, is above the law. The proceedings were swift and brutal. The commission's lead counsel laid out the case against Thorne, presenting a condensed but devastating summary of the investigation's findings. He presented the sentencing data, the financial records linking Thorne to the private prison company, and sworn affidavit from Sarah Jenkins and other court staff. He played a recording of one of Thorne's threatening voicemails to a witness. The final blow was a videotaped deposition from former prosecutor Peterson. On the screen, Peterson, looking haggard and ashamed, detailed the systemic corruption. He recounted specific conversations where Thorne had used racial slurs to refer to defendants and explicitly stated his intention to make an example of them. When the evidence had been presented, Thorne's attorney, Arthur Vance, rose. There would be no defense. "Your Honors," Vance said, his voice flat and devoid of its usual bluster. "On behalf of my client, we offer no contest to the charges. Judge Thorne has agreed to accept the consequences of his actions. It was a surrender, not an apology." The head of the commission, a respected retired appellate judge, looked down at Thorne. "Mr. Thorne, do you have anything you wish to say before this commission renders its decision?" Thorne rose unsteadily to his feet. He finally looked up, his gaze sweeping across the room. He seemed to be searching for a friendly face, a sign of support, but found none. His eyes met him for a brief, fleeting moment. In her calm, steady gaze, he saw no triumph, no gloating. He saw only the dispassionate face of justice itself. "I," he began, his voice, a hoarse whisper. "I served this county for 30 years. I worked hard. I made mistakes. It was a weak, pathetic attempt to frame a career of malice as a series of simple errors." The commission was unmoved.
The chairman delivered the verdict. Marcus Thorne. This commission finds that you have violated every sacred tenet of your judicial oath. You have used your office not as a shield to protect the innocent, but as a sword to punish the vulnerable. You have poisoned the well of justice. Therefore, it is the unanimous decision of this commission that you be immediately and permanently removed from the bench. Furthermore, we are referring our entire findings to the United States Department of Justice for criminal prosecution on charges including but not limited to conspiracy, wire fraud, and deprivation of rights under color of law. A gasp went through the room. It was the harshest possible outcome. Not only was his career over, but he was facing federal prison time. As bailiffs, not his own, but...
Officers of the commission moved to escort him from the room. Thorne finally seemed to comprehend the totality of his ruin. The empire he had built on fear and prejudice had crumbled to dust. The gavel had fallen not from his hand, but upon his own head. Imani watched him go, then turned her attention to the faces in the gallery. She saw tears, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief, of release, of a community seeing the first dawn after a long and terrible night. Her work in Oak Haven was far from over, but the reign of its tyrant king was finished. Justice delayed for so long had finally arrived. 6 months after Marcus Thorne's spectacular fall from grace, the Oak Haven courthouse still stood a monument of cold gray stone, but inside its walls a quiet revolution was underway. The oppressive silence of fear had been replaced by a tentative hum of activity. The whispers of dread supplanted by conversations about reform and due process. The shadow of the hammer was gone, but the damage he had inflicted was a deep wound in the community, and wounds take time to heal. Attorney General Imani Hayes knew that removing the tumor was only the first step. The patient still needed to recover. She had established a special task force, the Oak Haven Justice Initiative, with a broad mandate to not only investigate past wrongdoings, but to fundamentally rebuild the county's judicial system. To lead it, she appointed Judge Annabelle Rodriguez, a retired state Supreme Court justice known for her sharp legal mind and unwavering integrity. Judge Rodriguez, a formidable woman with a non-nonsense demeanor, began a top-to-bottom purge. Officer Miller the Baif, who had laughed at him, was fired along with several other court officers, found to have histories of excessive force complaints. Prosecutor Peterson, having fulfilled his obligation to testify, quietly resigned. His career in public service was over. He ended up taking a low-level job at a small insurance defense firm, his name forever tied to the biggest judicial scandal in the state's history. The most impactful work was done by the Sentencing Review Board. Working out of a makeshift office in the courthouse basement, a team of dedicated public defenders, law students, and retired lawyers began the monumental task of re-examining thousands of cases presided over by Thorne. One by one, stories of injustice were brought into the light. The young man who received 60 days for a broken tail light had his conviction expugned and received a formal apology from the state. The young mother who had lost her license over unpaid parking tickets had it immediately reinstated. An anonymous donation widely believed to have been arranged by Imani's office paid off her outstanding fines. Sarah Jenkins, the Claire, whose meticulous diaries had been so crucial to the investigation, was brought out of her stressful retirement. Judge Rodriguez hired her as a special consultant, her 15 years of institutional knowledge now being used to train new clerks on ethical conduct and proper procedure. The woman who had been a fearful observer was now an agent of change, her quiet strength finally recognized and rewarded. Meanwhile, the final chapter of Marcus Thorne's story played out not in Oak Haven, but in a federal courtroom 200 meters away. His trial was short. The evidence presented by the U.S. Attorney's Office, built on the foundation of Imani's investigation, was so overwhelming that his defense barely put up a fight. He was found guilty on all counts: fraud, conspiracy, and the deprivation of civil rights. The judge, a stern appointee from another state, sentenced him to 20 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of parole. The news reported that the once powerful judge, stripped of his title and his dignity, was now federal inmate, year 73,406,083. He was no longer a king on a throne, but a number in a system destined to live out his days, surrounded by the kind of men he had once sent away with a smirk and a bang of his gavel. The karma was as complete as it was devastating. One crisp autumn afternoon, months later, Imani Hayes drove back to Oak Haven. She didn't go to the courthouse. Instead, she went to a community center in the very neighborhood that had borne the brunt of Thorne's tyranny. She wasn't there in any official capacity. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, the same way she had on the day she first appeared in his court.
She watched as children played basketball on a newly resurfaced court, their laughter echoing in the evening air. She saw the young mother from the hallway, Maria, arriving to pick up her son. Not on a bus, but in a modest sedan, the car she needed for the job she had been able to keep. Maria caught Imani's eye and gave her a small, knowing smile of profound gratitude. A local community organizer, a man who had fought against Thorne's court for years, approached her. "You know," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for the first time in my lifetime, people from this neighborhood are going to that courthouse for jury duty, and they're not afraid. They're actually proud to serve." Imani felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the autumn sun. This was the true victory. It wasn't Thorne in a prison cell. It was the restoration of faith. It was the mending of the deep, painful tear in the fabric of the community. Her journey had started with a meaningless slip of paper, a personal insult in a cold, dark room. But it had ended here in the light, with the sound of children laughing and the quiet rebuilding of trust. The House of Justice in Oak Haven was still being repaired, but for the first time in a generation, its foundation was finally sound. This story is a stark reminder that the fight for justice is not won in a single battle, but in the courage to stand up even when you feel small. Judge Thorne believed his power made him untouchable, but he forgot a fundamental truth. A title is not a shield for tyranny. Attorney General Imani Hayes showed us that true authority comes not from a robe or a gavel, but from an unwavering commitment to equality and the rule of law. She used a moment of profound disrespect, not for personal revenge, but to dismantle a corrupt system and give a voice back to the voiceless. If this story of karmic justice and the triumph of integrity resonated with you, please help us share it. Hit that like button, share this video with your friends and family, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories where accountability prevails. Let us know in the comments what you think justice for Oak Haven should look like.